So welcome to the panel on law enforcement and social media. I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves, how they see fit. Can we all just sort of introduce ourselves quickly? My name is Jay Stanley, and I'm Senior Policy Analyst for the Speech, Privacy, and Technology Program at the National ACLU.
I'm Sadhbh McCarthy. I'm the Director of the Centre for Irish and European Security, based in Dublin, Ireland.
And I'm Mark Cleverley with IBM as Director of Public Safety Solutions globally.
And my name is Diedrich. I'm the Privacy Officer and Attorney for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, which is a state law enforcement agency.
Okay, great. So Mark, do you want to tell us from your technology perspective what the world looks like in this area?
Yeah, sure. I will. I'll just give you a few minutes on some of the history of technology in this space, and perhaps that sets the scene for why we are where we are today. And I want to preface my remarks by saying I'm not a policy person. I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually a salesman in most of my work, and a technologist by profession. So if I could start a few years ago when we really made some new and fundamental observations about the way that technology was moving. Three particular observations that were made around the time of, I guess I was working on this in 2008. We categorize them as the three I's. It's a bit of a stretch, but the first I is instrumentation, the way that the world is becoming instrumented with technology, where we're much more able now to understand things about the physical world as well as the digital world through the use of sensors of various kinds. Everything from RFID chips to smartphones with cameras, to the street pole cameras, to transponders on the roads, to medical sensors in the home. That instrumentation was proliferating rapidly, and therefore generating vast amounts of very diverse information that we really didn't have before. Second I was interconnection. The way that, not just because of the internet, but partly because of the internet, partly also because of raw bandwidth and standardization and information exchange, we were much more able, and we would become much more able in the future, to ship information around from place to place, from system to system, from person to system, and so on, much more effectively. And the third I we called intelligence, which was the use of very high-performance analytical computing on those sources of information that are now available to us. So you've got all this instrumentation out in the world generating information of various kinds, very fast, very large volumes, very diverse. You have to be able to move it around, ingest it, and analyze it fast enough to be useful so that you gain some insight that's actionable quickly enough to be able to make a difference. And I'm not just talking about the law enforcement world here. I'm talking about everything. Industry does, commerce does, government does. Those three I's operate very significantly in describing the nature of the projects that the world is embarked upon. And they're not just necessarily pure technology projects, but they can be societally impactful projects like our Smarter Cities initiative is taking around the world. So those three technology observations are kind of paralleled by the way society is changing as well. If you think about instrumentation, you think we're all carrying little devices that allow us to capture things and transmit them in ways that we couldn't before. We are interconnecting in different ways, and particularly then through social media, right? The whole rise of the social media universe parallels that interconnection phenomenon. And then the third I, which is the use of high-performance analytics, really you can think about that paralleled by people's access to raw compute power. Every time you do a Google search, or you post a video on YouTube, or you use Amazon, you're actually using some really powerful compute power in the cloud. You don't really know that you're doing it, but it's there. So it was kind of interesting to us that those three technology observations were paralleled by the way society was changing, and that's really what started us thinking about how technology would be used in the future as opposed to maybe the way it's been used in the past. So one of the offshoots of that was, what is the impact of the rise of the social media universe? And in my particular customer set, that has a particular impact, particular interest, as first of all, as a tool for outreach, for communication, for talking to the public that people serve in different ways. And by the way, in ways that people are asking, right? So people themselves ordinary citizens want to interact with government just as much with law enforcement in the new ways, the ways that they're comfortable with through social media. And there have been interesting work done on asking people how quickly they would expect, say, the emergency services to respond if they were to post the problem on Facebook or tweet their issue, as opposed to calling 911 or the emergency number for your country. And people over the years since the emergence of social media have really begun to expect to be able to use social media for all their interactions and for many more things than they used to. So we see that curve continuing, and therefore it's a very important outreach and communication channel both ways. The second big use that presents itself of social media is obviously as a source, an extra source, if you like, or an adjunct source of intelligence about what's going on in the world, about what's happening in the jurisdiction, about what sentiments people are expressing about certain things, and so on. And by the way, this isn't limited, of course, to government, to law enforcement. We do significant analytical work with customers around consumer sentiment, around products, around what people are saying about Coca-Cola at this particular point in time, or whether people enjoyed that last game at Wimbledon, right? So in many ways, both the private sector and the public sector have taken on more interest in what's happening in the social media universe, largely because of the development of those technology capabilities. And there are many software tools that help with gathering information, clearly organizing it, and analyzing it in different ways that have been deployed in pursuit of those objectives. So that's what's, I think, the technology history of why we are where we are today. And I'm happy to pass it back to the panelists here to take us a little further.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so thanks, Mark. Social media is a technology which is quite different, I think, than others we've seen before. The reason for that is that it's a bilateral communication medium which allows information to be conveyed and solicited between the citizen and the state. And that has a quite different meaning than we traditionally think about in terms of surveillance technologies like CCTV. So social media can be both something that's used by the state to survey their citizenry, but it can also be used by the state to solicit information from that same citizenry for the benefits of law enforcement. But in order for that to be an effective tool and not an abusive tool, we need to create trust networks. So if people don't perceive that at times, that on a day-to-day mainstream basis, that the state is using social media in a measured, appropriate manner, they're not necessarily going to trust that medium when it becomes something that's needed, and that we need the citizens to come back and help us to solve a particularly difficult crime. The other thing is that that's also something that's problematic for the state, because if they haven't built up a proper trust network or a trust strategy, they won't know which actors in the social media sphere to use effectively when they want to, in turn, solicit information back. Governments always instrumentalize technology. Governments valorize technology as, it's going to save the world, it's going to create jobs, it's going to help us solve crime, it's going to, when flooding happens, we're going to know exactly what's going on because, you're all going to tell us. Or they demonize technology. Think of the children, cyberbullying, violent radicalization online. Of course, neither of these extremes are true. But what they do is they undermine the potential to have a proper discourse which allows us to understand how technologies can be used effectively to promote this engagement between the citizens and the state. And in particular, social media can have negative implications, because if your only experience of how a law enforcement agency uses social media is either to as a tool of amplification of a message in a propaganda kind of context, because it's not mediated by any journalist to say if this is, there's no mediation on whether that message is good or bad. It's just the police are telling us this, the law enforcement agency is saying this, so you must believe it. or if it's used as a tool of surveillance. So the law enforcement agencies, they're looking at who's saying what online, who's talking to whom on Facebook, and they're making inferences about that are a kind of a surveillance, let's say a surveillance modality. It's also because social media is a domesticated technology. And what I mean by that is, in traditional law enforcement paradigms, you can be followed to the point of your door. After that, the guys, they can be discreetly following you all along. You don't know anything about it. But once you go into your house and you close the door, that's it. They, unless they have a wiretap, they really can't do anything else. But with social media, they can follow you past that point, and sort of literally come into your home and like see what you're doing and what you're thinking, or make inferences about that. So this notion of a domesticated technology, a bilateral technology, if not mediated properly by law enforcement agencies, is not going to create the trust relationship that's needed when something happens and law enforcement need it as a tool to help them solve crime, to promote better community policing, or to do any of those things. So I guess I'm going to sort of summarize this, because it'd be nicer if we had an open conversation. I would say that there's two really good examples of case studies of where social media has worked well and where it's worked badly. Working well, actually, is in the police service of Northern Ireland. I don't know if any of you know, well, probably you know sort of roughly, but I mean, Northern Ireland, although it's post-conflict, is still in quite a troubled state. There's huge political tensions between different community groups all the time, and this literally erupts into riots and parades and sort of kind of mobs of people, interacting with each other. But the police service in Northern Ireland have adopted a communication strategy which, sort of starts at the point at which we're using social media to tell you about what we're doing, to help you. And then we're asking you to give us some information back. And then when we need help in doing something, we will do it. And then they also use social media really effectively in crowd control contexts. Of course, that's a sort of a double-edged sword there, because crowds can also use social media to say where the police are, but that's a kind of slightly separate issue. That's a really good example of where it can work very well. When you've invested time to figure out how your community use this. You don't see it as some sort of shortcut policing, because that's often what it's perceived to be. Bad example is the Boston Marathon, where they had this sort of crowdsourcing on Reddit of, who is this guy? We think he might be a suspicious person as part of he might be a terrorist. And of course he was completely wrongly identified, and there was lots of implications for that. And for one thing, it undermined the value of crowdsourced support for law enforcement agencies, because there's a fine line between crowdsourcing through social media and digital vigilantism. I'm going to leave it at that, because that's my next area of research is going to be digital vigilantism. So I'd welcome your thoughts. Just finally, I'd like to say that I came over here thanks to Jay inviting me to speak on this panel, and also to examine the determinant effects of alcohol on post-Snowden EU-US relationships. I'd like to thank you all for supporting me in that research last night.
How's it going?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to plug in a PowerPoint here. I've begun to get questions from the media, from our affiliates around the country about law enforcement access to social media, and I'm trying to work on a policy for the ACLU, and what I'm going to talk about today is sort of an initial draft version of sort of what I think maybe we ought to say, what our position ought to be about this. If I can get this on. Where's our IT guy?
You got it?
Oh, I do. Okay, great. Could you kill the lights in the front? I don't know if you need to close the shades, but just kill the lights temporarily. So, I think that the way that I think about it is there's really two ways of dividing law enforcement access to social media. There's material that's been made public, like tweets, and material that's private, whether it's private email, private messages on Facebook, private messages on Twitter. And then there's retail access versus wholesale access. Retail being where law enforcement has a particular suspicion about a particular individual or small group of individuals, versus wholesale, where the government wraps in large amounts of material. And so you can take these two categories and make a little chart. Private retail collection, where you want to access somebody's private material, should require a warrant. And that's pretty clearly established. a wholesale collection of private material should not be permitted. That's what the NSA is doing. This is why there's a huge storm here. And then particular retail collection of public material, in most cases, is probably fine. If a police officer has a particular suspect and they think that he's involved in wrongdoing and he has a public Twitter feed, then there's no general problem with them looking at that. So in some ways, what I want to address here, in the trickiest area, is wholesale access to public material. So one perspective is, so we had a call from one of our affiliates where a guy had built, and this was not in Colorado or Washington State, he had built a marijuana grow operation in his attic. He was very proud of it. He posted a picture of it on Facebook. One of his friends was a cop in Florida who called up to New England and tipped off the local police, and he got arrested. So from one perspective, you can just say, well, the guy's an idiot. Too bad.
Yeah.
So sad. But I think that there is something about social media that short circuits our privacy intuitions that we need to take into account. This is a really good presentation that a former Google engineer did. And the part of the problem with social media like Facebook is that it short circuits the normally disconnected groups that we keep in our lives. And he tells the story of somebody who posted something on Facebook after going out with her LA friends to a gay bar, and she realized only later that all the swimming kids that she taught would also be seeing it. And so it short circuits these things that you would normally and naturally intuitively keep separate in your life. And also there's just audience size. I mean, when you end up in a conversation on Facebook with somebody, it's too easy to think that you're really having a conversation with the people who are talking, maybe a few other people you have in your mind, but I think it's not uncommon to have 1,000 or 2,000 Facebook friends. And people say things on Facebook they would never say in front of an auditorium full of 1,000 or 2,000 people. Again, it short circuits our privacy intuitions. And of course, then there's a whole thing with this famous graph of how Facebook changed its default settings over time. That just adds to the problem, right? Because it's harder to keep track of what is and isn't public. So we're seeing all these products that are being sold to law enforcement to engage in mass surveillance of open social media. Rapid content analytics, this is an example of one product. Agile digital detectives tap into social networks to keep ahead of threats, identify relevant groups or individuals to monitor within communities, distill and analyze to identify valuable intelligence, address volume of data with automated tools, monitor online communities, detect early warning signs, automate surveillance, receive automatic alerts, data mine for threatening language, quickly sort through huge amounts of information. And our basic recommendation, I think, is that really you should think of this in two ways. To the individual, we want to say, look, you should consider that anything that you put online that is not totally private, you should think of it as public. That's the best way to protect yourself. But to law enforcement, I don't think that we necessarily want law enforcement digging through Americans' open social media postings without suspicion. You can say, well, the law enforcement can read anything that's in the newspaper, right? But at the same time, we don't pay our law enforcement to sit around reading the newspapers. If it's not going to contribute to solving crime, then they shouldn't be doing it. And so there are, I guess, two large reasons why, as a policy matter, now obviously there's not really a constitutional issue with if you post something publicly, then you can't really complain if law enforcement looks at it from a constitutional perspective. But as a policy matter, do we actually want our law enforcement doing this? And there are two big reasons why. There are two big downsides to it. One is effectiveness. Again, it's not an effective way to solve crime to wantonly search through huge volumes of material. And also, there can be what I call the asymmetry between past and future. I wrote a blog post about this, which is that, if a crime occurs and you go backwards in time, you can see all the precursors to that crime. You can see how, well, this A led to B, led to C, led to D, and that looks to the crime. And look, there were all these signs on social networks that a crime was going to happen. So therefore, let's go look for similar signs and we can prevent other crimes. The fallacy with that is that for every chain that moving forward in time, there are a million other possible iterations and directions that those things can go. And so the causal arrow can be very clear looking backwards, but to look forwards, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen. And so I think that it's easy to become seduced into thinking that you can identify precursors to crimes through things like social media. And then the other big downside is chilling effects. This was a British lad who tweeted out that he was going to he was looking forward to his trip to America, and he was going to go party hard in America, or to use British slang, he was going to go destroy America, and he got caught at customs and thrown in prison with some Mexican drug dealers for 12 hours after landing in Los Angeles, because he said he was going to dig up Marilyn Monroe and destroy America, and they took him seriously. So I mean, you know, when you hear about stupidity like that, and stories like that circulate, it can make everybody self-conscious and self-aware. And we don't want a society in which we feel as if our conversations, when we gather, when we organize, when we get into meetings, that there is some sort of police presence lurking, watching everything and watching us. That's not the kind of inhibited society that we want. If there's no reason to suspect that anybody's planning wrongdoing, there's no reason to be monitored. So I've come up with some basic principles that I'm sort of going to put out there, and I'd love feedback on them if you think I'm totally unrealistic from my other panelists and in the audience. And basically that there should be a defined, objective, and valid purpose for law enforcement monitoring of social media. There's the precise verbiage, but I won't go through that. There should be evidence of effectiveness. As I said, there are a lot of questions about effectiveness here. And that social media data shouldn't be evaluated, collected, and maintained without reasonable suspicion that the subject is involved in wrongdoing. Restrictions on collecting First Amendment protected information. Undercover activity online should be closely supervised in ways similar to the way that offline undercover, at least as strongly as offline undercover activity. Some police departments have very weak offline undercover activity policies, but and that there should be specific binding public policies specifying things like data retention, proper limits in the sharing of data, and so forth. And one of the government entities that's doing, besides the police, that's doing this kind of monitoring is schools. And it's true there are certain ways in which children are different because they are young and so forth. But when it comes to mass monitoring of social media, our position is that they should follow the same policies above as law enforcement for the same reasons. So that's our initial thinking on that. So, thank you.
Why don't we put that chart, that box framework?
The four-part thing?
Yeah, let's put that up, because that'd be a good way to keep the conversation going.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to react, because I very much appreciate what Jay has said. Lord. I don't think this is on. Is it on?
Yeah.
All right. I very much appreciate what Jay has said. The reason I am here is the director of the GBI, who I work for, is the chair of the Criminal Intelligence Coordinating Council. And we put out a publication in February 2013 under the auspices of Global Justice Information Sharing Network. And it's called Developing a Policy on the Use of Social Media in Intelligence and Investigative Activities. The GBI is the second law enforcement agency that put together a policy regarding the use of social media for intelligence and investigative activities. New York Police Department did come out with one before us, which was helpful for me when I was preparing ours. There's not that much that I disagree with what Jay has said. We have gone around the country. I've spoken to all of the Fusion Center workshops last summer, stressing the necessity for fusion centers to have policies in how they're utilizing social media, to be doing exactly what Jay is describing, to make sure it's for a lawful law enforcement purpose, to make sure you know what you're doing, that you are focusing on potential criminal activity. Or the one area where I think we could tease out a little bit is when you have an event going on, whether or not you would be averse to some sort of social monitoring of social media from a perspective of preventing a threat. That's another area that we do have guidance in our policy. But it's absolutely crucial. It's ironic because when Mark said, you know, that there's been something out here about how quickly would law enforcement respond if someone reported something on Facebook or Twitter a crime, that's completely contrary to the whole notion, well, we don't want Big Brother watching everything that's going on Facebook. So, and that's the tension that exists. The tension is between public safety. Everyone wants their child to be safe at school. That's why the schools go way overboard. Everyone wants to be able to get on a plane and not have someone try and blow themselves up on it. So that's why, you know, we go overboard when we see destroy, we generally law enforcement. So there's very much a tension there, and so conversations like this are good. I think the beauty of the ACLU, they've been watching the fusion centers for a long time, and it's for the good. That I like what Jay has put together. It's somewhat analogous of this publications online. The way we look at it is the amount of approval and authorization that's going to be needed for a law enforcement person assigned to the Fusion Center when they're looking at social media for open source information, which is the typical term that we use in law enforcement for the public. You know, we don't require any specific authorization, but if we were to utilize a online alias where it would be coming, we'd be looking at something and you wouldn't know that it was the GBI looking, that's what we call an online alias. And then when you're actually online undercover activity, that would be where you would be using a fake persona, friending someone on Facebook, interacting. And we only allow agents to do that. We require a memo. We keep track of the undercover identities that are used, and we expect for there to be specific reports of all the activity. And of course, what you're probably familiar with is the internet child pornography investigations. That's your classic example of that. On his rubric, I'm not sure that I think warrant, I'm not quite willing to go there. You know, the law has always allowed police officers to assume undercover identities and go in and interact with people who are engaged in criminal activity. So my feeling is when there's criminal activity going on, then if we do assume that alias and interact with the individual as they're doing their criminal activity. So when we go into a chat room and pose as a 13-year-old girl or a 10-year-old girl, and I know you were saying that's, you know, protect the women, the children, but, you know, the reality is some really bad things happen in those things. So I wouldn't be willing to agree that it should require a warrant, but I would strongly agree with Jay that it absolutely has to be focused on criminal activity, and it cannot be focused on what is clearly political speech, First Amendment protected activity. And law enforcement gets burned all the time when we go too far and monitor things when it is just First Amendment activity. That's what created the guidance that we have in 28 CFR in the early 70s, was the monitoring that was going on. And we've also done a publication on that as well. So I've ranted enough, but go back to you, Jay.
Either of you want to jump in at this point?
Actually, yes. Don. The thing about social media is that it's back to this idea of shortcut policing. It's the tweet that Jay was talking about. The guy says, "I'm going to go destroy America."
Sure.
It's the lack of context and the lack of insight into the people that are being engaged with. So in traditional, I mean, okay, your point is right. In traditional policing methodologies, it's perfectly acceptable to go undercover into a sort of a criminal network. Okay. The problem is, because it's social media, police are using the data that's freely available to them to make interpretations. It's out of context, and what they consider to be a criminal activity may not be anything other than a use of language that they're unfamiliar with. And so I completely support the requirement, you know, for a warrant, because otherwise you get the situation like with the kid who got arrested. And so, you know, it's not the same. It is not the same as saying, you know, well, if it's criminal activity, because the problem is, how do you make that decision? Because you're not in the community. I mean, community policing is all about understanding your community, knowing the actors, and understanding the context of their actions. In social media, you don't know the actors, you don't understand the context of their actions, and so you end up making assumptions or inferences from language that aren't necessarily true.
Right, and I hear that. I guess the border example, to me, that would never be probable cause to make an arrest if that tweet or post had occurred in Atlanta and we were just investigating. I'm not sure if we've got more because there's lower protections in terms of entering the country. You know, you can search vehicles without probable cause, you can search us as we come into the country. So could we maybe shift that example a little bit, because I don't think there is probable cause based on that tweet to make any sort of law enforcement action, other than that you may want to, if you identify this person, you may want to go out to the school, talk to the school resource officer, find out what's going on with that child, and see if there's been anything else. So,
But is the challenge there that it's down to the subjective or the policy of the individual police departments? I mean, obviously I'm speaking about this in the European context, not obviously the US, but it would be exactly the same. There's no difference here. This is exactly the same situation. It's understanding. It's basically, the problem with social media is it's very difficult to put it in context. And that's why we struggle with this in terms of interpretation for law enforcement purposes.
fair enough, but I think, and I'm going to let you jump in, but I think that for us in law enforcement, if you're doing it right, if you're doing an investigation, this is just the very beginning. And you've got to do more to build your probable cause for either a search warrant or an arrest warrant. Jeff?
Let's talk about this issue of events, because I think that is maybe one area where we differ, and so therefore interesting. So, there was recently a large amount of documents that were released around surveillance of the Occupy protests, and there was a huge amount of surveillance going on of the Occupy protesters, really excessive, very, very detailed stuff, and most of it was through open social media. That didn't seem right to us. It seemed as though there were a lot of surveillance going on where, based on First Amendment protected activity, and it didn't correlate tightly, or if at all, to circumstances where there was evidence that particular people were planning to commit a crime. And of course, we've seen in other areas, there's a vast amount of, monitoring of youth, gang purposes, and some of that may well be justified because there's a lot of gang stuff that goes on social media, threats and counter threats that actually erupt into physical violence, and I'm sure there's difficult line drawing areas there. But I'd just be curious, to hear you elaborate more on sort of, how your agency and other in your allied agencies around the country sort of view in that area, and what the practices are, what the policies are, and so forth.
Okay, well, let me just ask you a question. Is the problem that the information is still being maintained by a law enforcement agency? It's been retained, and that's what is troubling? Because to me, if you've got a real-time situation going on where you've got a lot of people in an area and, can become victims of crime or criminal activity can occur, as your real-time monitoring does not seem problematic. It does seem problematic to me. I would agree with you that if law enforcement is going to maintain that information forever, or 5 years or whatever, if there's been no criminal activity, and the retention period is always going to be of question. You can never get people to agree how long you should retain information. But so is that part of it, or is it just the actual monitoring real time that these tweets are going on back and forth?
I think we can agree that we can agree on the retention.
Yeah.
But I do think that the live monitoring is problematic as well. I mean, if people are peacefully organizing and there is no evidence that they're involved in wrongdoing, I don't know that they should feel that in every if they get together in a room to plan the next day's speeches or whatever, they shouldn't feel that there's undercover police, we're not a nation of secret police, infiltrating them. Well, yes, that's an assertion, not necessarily a description. Well,
I would be inclined to agree with you, but
yeah, I mean, we're concerned that there are be big chilling effects, that every time some Americans want to get together and plan some political action, they're going to be paranoid that there are police, and that some of the more timid Americans will not feel free to, exercise their First Amendment rights because of that, and that this is in some ways the online equivalent of that. And so yes, it is a concern, just the monitoring, even if the information isn't retained.
Right, and I guess that would be where the product that we used with social media monitoring had keywords. So what you're describing, the conversation about what's going to occur the next day, unless it says flash mob, some sort of violent thing, it's not going to even be picking it up. So all that is going on. And that's where I think it's important that you have some clear policy guidance on what it is that you're listening for.
Do you mind if I come in on that? After there was a, I don't know, if everybody here knows this, but there was some extensive rioting in London in 2011. There was a guy arrested and he died in police custody. I can't remember whether he was shot or something occurred. Anyway, he died. And as a result of that, there was a protest in the urban area where he was from, which rapidly escalated into a riot, against the police, which just got out of hand. It just went completely crazy. It went from this one incident in a particular community where people were reacting to something and the perceived oppression by the police, and suddenly it had taken over the whole of London and extended to other cities in the UK in a kind of quiet period in the summer. The politicians were abroad, the Prime Minister had to come back from Italy from his holidays to deal with this. And one of the things that happened was that the organisation, or the sort of people telling each other where to go, was being done through social media, through Twitter and actually BlackBerry. I'm not familiar with the technology, but that BlackBerry thing, that whatever it is.
It's the messaging.
That's whatever, right? Yeah, okay, Luddite over here. No, I just don't know BlackBerry. Anyway, the police were completely behind the curve. They didn't know what was happening, right? They just could not cope with this, this sudden explosion of violence, and the fact that it was being organised, or they perceived it to be organised and managed through this technology that they had no resources to deal with. They weren't monitoring it, they weren't looking at it, they didn't understand it, they didn't know what was happening, and policing, good policing in times of riot isn't going in with shields and all of that. It's to a certain extent standing off to allow it to burn itself out rather than escalating and inflaming. But this was causing problems. So, and there was a total perception by the law enforcement agencies that the rioters, the crowds, were ahead of them, because the rioters were saying, oh, go to such and such a location because the police aren't there, and then don't go to that because the police are there. And anyway, so this thing, and when it sort of died down somewhat and things started getting back under control, and there's a whole other story, by the way, about the post-rioting the next day, but after all the carnage and destruction, about how communities came together through social media to help clean up and to support each other. But let's just focus on this bit. So the first thing that happened was the government, or the policing agencies, they blamed social media. They said that it was a sort of, social media has caused this. It's a causal thing. They were talking about things like, we'll turn off Twitter. If this ever happens again, we're going to turn off Twitter, we're going to turn off Facebook, we're going to shut down. No, honestly, this is absolutely serious. The lack of insight, understanding, and this notion that social media was causal rather than facilitating or enabling was just beyond everybody. So on the back of that, very quickly, a guy called David Ormond, who was the former head of intelligence services for the UK, he was at the time of the Iraq War, he was the guy who massaged the documentation and so on. He's with a think tank called Demos now. So he kind of sat down and they came together and they developed this policy. You're probably familiar with it, Dawn. It's called SOCMINT. So they've now coined the expression SOCMINT, which is basically open source social media intelligence. And he goes around and he does this talk, right? And he sort of tells policymakers and operational people and police forces and industry, and he goes, so this is social media intelligence. You're allowed to use everything that's on, it's not just that it's freely available, it's a free-for-all, you can do what you like. And he interestingly, when he talks about the crowd things, he talks about the London riots, he correlates Occupy Wall Street with the London riots. And that's the thing that's kind of scary. It's like this idea that if you have a public protest which is antithetical to the state in some manner, that can actually be a bad thing, and therefore it's fair game to observe. Do you know what I mean? It's a sort of as opposed to, there is a fundamental difference between observing social media exchange in a riot context where people are getting harmed and hurt and awful things are happening. I think it's perfectly legitimate that the police use their capacity to monitor that social media in order to try and limit that. It's not the same when people are just taking, the right to protest, the right to freedom of association, freedom of expression, and the right to. Just one last thing on that is that it's always amazing how the state. I sound like a real anarchist, don't I? The state, the state, right? But it's true. Okay, I mean, when it's the Arab Spring, Twitter is a force for good. We valorize Twitter. This is going to help those poor people who need democracy. And then when it's the London riots, we demonize it. Twitter is the cause of the rioting. So, I mean, this completely incoherent narrative and public discourse is part of what the problem is. Sorry, I mean, just my insight into the London riots and social media.
I have to abdicate responsibility. I'm talking about policy here, but I just want to drop two things into the conversation that came to my mind. First of all, it's clearly the case that innovations in technology can present challenges, but it's also the case that innovations in technology can help protect privacy and protect free speech. And so, your ability to do audit trails on who has accessed what information, when, and was that in accordance with policy and in compliance with regulations is way enhanced these days from what it was before. So the first thing to remember is that technology can help as well as potentially hinder. The second thing, and stepping back from law enforcement to the broader scenario, if you're looking at analysis of social media for consumer sentiment and so on, and for maybe deciding, what is it I should go sell you next time you're standing in front of McDonald's, or you're at this particular display at Macy's, because I know from your tweet that you're looking at this display now, maybe I can go sell you something else. And a lot of that goes on. But there is existing law and evolving law around consumer protection, around anti-discrimination and so on, in the use of those sales techniques, if you like, that seems to be working, or at least so far working pretty adequately. So maybe there's some guidance we can take from both of those points.
I love the ACLU. Please take this constructively. First thing, you cheated when you put up the New York Times from 1905 as an example of effectiveness. The reality is Google's bot can read that in 10 nanoseconds, and law enforcement does go through sources like that. So to say that it's a initial effectiveness because there's a newspaper and we don't pay police to read newspapers is just wrong, right? Because you can read them electronically, you can scan for patterns. Why would you even think that?
We don't want the police. The police have limited resources and limited time, and it is not effective for them to spend that time trolling through the ocean, trying to boil the ocean to discover wrongdoing rather than pursuing known evidence, known leads, known reports of crimes, known criminals.
I get your
right?
point. I'm just trying to point out that it's not their time. It's the time of a computer that they can just set to read every newspaper in the world and to look for things. So you're it's a dated example.
Well, we're getting
It's dated. I was literally dated because it's from 19.
Well, I mean, I just put that out there sort of a little humor, but I mean, I'm not sure this is substantive just because the newspaper was old, but I'm not sure I understand your point. I mean, look, there's a question about what it means to read, right?
Yeah.
If your computers are trolling through it, does Google read every newspaper in the world? In some ways it does.
Well, Watson does.
But would we want law enforcement spending the money to build the server farms to collect all that information and store it? No.
Here's a harder question. Every time we see a shooting in Las Vegas, we had a stabbing in Calgary, the Facebook page of the perpetrator is up there and often gives signs. Isn't the public going to push back? Remember, I love the ACLU, push back and say, well, wait a minute, there's obviously information in there. They said they were neo-Nazis. This guy said he was going to stab people. So the police should be able to find that. It's just the police aren't good enough at doing it, so they should get AI, pattern recognition, sarcasm detector, and so on. In other words, and those examples.
Mark can say that.
Well, sarcasm detector.
Well, I will say, and again, I'm not a policy person, but I will tell you a little bit about. You mentioned Watson, which is an example of what we call deep question and answer and content analytics. Extremely powerful. Those of you who don't know, Watson was a machine we built originally to play Jeopardy. If you're from the US, you'll know Jeopardy is a general knowledge quiz game, and it actually beat several previous champions of Jeopardy. So it was, and it sounds trivial, but it's an amazing advance in computing. And we're using Watson now to help with medical diagnoses because it can absorb more medical papers and information than any single human can, and can suggest possible diagnoses and so on. Now, still, you need a human at the end of the chain to make the decision, but as an advisor and as a discovery agent, and potentially, as you mentioned, the sarcasm detector because of the sophistication of content analytics, those things are available today and becoming more sophisticated. So I think you're on a good point about, you know, what does it mean to read a newspaper? Because if Watson's reading the paper and giving you 3 potential hypotheses with levels of confidence, then have you really read it? Have you spent time on it? Not really. So I don't know the right or wrong answer to that particular question, but there's certainly assistive technologies that would make that lack of productivity thing kind of fade away.
I mean, to follow on your question, I mean, part of what your scenario is would fall within the upper right there. I mean, if there was a criminal who did something and then everybody goes and looks at his social media, that's fine, right? Because it's reasonable suspicion. If you then say, well, he did this, this, and this, A, B, and C before he did the shooting, so let's go find everybody else who did A, B, and C, so we can make sure they don't do shootings. That is the fallacy that I was talking about earlier, because for every person who does A, B, and C, it's still 1 in a gazillion who actually does a shooting. And it also has the chilling effects downside, which is now everybody who types has to pause and say, wait a second, is this going to be misinterpreted by the police officer who's going to be reading it, or their computer? It makes no difference. And cause consequences for me and get me to be investigated and fall into the eye of Sauron, or the spotlight of law enforcement activity. And that is a significant downside to something. So the effectiveness is low, the downside is high, so that's why we say that as a policy matter it should be done.
Quick one, how's your policy going to deal all of us wearing video cameras and live streaming? Because that technology is coming out right now. Is that social media? What quadrant is that in?
That's social media. I guess that's another form of data that one is creating about oneself, just like tweeting what you ate for breakfast. And
it's no different from Instagram, Flickr right now.
Yeah, just a higher frame rate.
Right.
So I mean, and we work on. I've worked on the right to photography, so that there's a lot of tangled issues. We're against public video surveillance, but we're in favor of individuals' right to take photographs. But it gets into that area. But yeah.
I think we oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask, because I don't really know, do you have your own Facebook page?
Me personally?
No, the police, as a department, to engage the public where they feel at risk or where there's crime. Because I know places that do that, and they say, oh, we need help, we need the public's help to track down this person. They post the image of somebody that's just committed something, a crime, and the public has been reporting back and telling them, and they're finding missing persons that way. And, it's opening up that gap that you were saying that was there before. It's engaging the public to help the police with crimes, and then somebody will post up there, oh, there's a break-in going on at such and such a place, all those sorts of things are happening on Facebook. So, does the police do that?
Sure. Absolutely. Now, at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, because we're a state investigative agency and for the most part we're requested by local law enforcement, we just stood one up a few months ago. But local law enforcement is definitely utilizing it just for what you're describing. Before I went to law school, I was in a local police department in Jacksonville, North Carolina. I was in the community services unit, and we used to go out and do community watch meetings. And that was what we encouraged people, was call us if you see something, let us know. Well, social media hugely, Facebook leverages that. It's wonderful. Great communication, and also the fact that we can push information out when needed. So sure, that's a positive piece.
Didn't the US invent the wanted poster in the Wild West? Isn't that some power?
Sure. Absolutely.
But I mean, what about the data that's collected there? Because people also post their comments, and they're pretty disgusting.
Right, and that is one that we have the blurb that says we reserve the right to remove things.
Yes.
So we're saying this is our site.
But they don't.
But yeah.
You guys heard about the NYPD, right? And their terrible fail with social media? where they put up, give us examples of your interaction, and everyone pretty much was brutality. So be careful what you wish for.
The thing about that is, I mean, the problem is that it has this potential to do lots of useful things, right? So this engagement with the citizens is really good. But if you marry this idea of law enforcement observing and reviewing and looking at social media in the bigger context, you know, something like people getting together and organizing Occupy Wall Street or something, and then you also get this bilateral thing where people are reporting on each other. And like, it sounds like it's a great thing that somebody's going to help you find the bad guy, or they're going to tell you, but the logical also inference from that is that people are looking at each other and they're absolutely reporting back to the state about other citizens. And for me, and it's a personal thing, that's the chilling thing for me. I mean, this has a sort of a Stasi connotation, because how do you manage that difference between genuine, legitimate support for law enforcement and this idea that everybody's snooping on everybody else?
And all running out of time. I feel like Don wants to respond.
Well, I would just say that the people who are responding, I mean, there is an order maintenance function, and people prefer not to have criminal activity in their neighborhoods. It's almost like you can't have it both ways. With the example you gave about the London riots, law enforcement was caught flat-footed, way behind, and so people are saying, why weren't you ahead of the curve, or why weren't you with them, or, something like that. But our role in society is order maintenance. That's, I would say, even higher priority than the investigation and detection of criminal activity. The presence of a police officer in uniform with a car provides a sense of safety to people. The presence of law enforcement at demonstrations, like the Nazis in Skokie, y'all's case, like the Klan in Georgia. The GBI used to work the Klan rallies when they would march in Forsyth County. That means that those values that we hold in our Constitution are protected. Now, we screw up. I mean, I've got a whole PowerPoint I could have brought with all the screw-ups that we've done. I'm not saying we do it right. I'm definitely not, and we need the ACLU to keep us honest. No question. Excuse me? Yes, sir.
Yeah, they do screw-ups all the time. Maybe they're higher.
So 2 quick questions to finish up here. We're just about out of time. Don, so you and your boss, Vernon Keenan, have been kind of on the cutting edge and leaders, it seems like, in this area of like putting forth solid, well thought out policies, even if we don't agree on events or whatever.
Every single one of them.
How do you, what's your, talking to your peers around the country, I mean, how are most states and law enforcement overall? Are they pretty decent, or are they all over the map? Are they doing a lot of crazy stuff? Or?
Well, I would say that in response to that, the fusion centers, because we've got the DHS funding and there is such an emphasis at the federal level as well on the privacy and civil rights and civil liberties, there's an effort to ensure that there is training on these issues and to push this information out. Your local law enforcement officer who's in a small town is only going to be concerned about order maintenance, and they may or may not be able to distill out that this is protected First Amendment activity, this is not criminal activity, it's just the reality of it. But I think, the conversation is occurring, and law enforcement, I will say this for law enforcement, I do training all the time. The courts, the guidance that we get, I mean, we screw up, we learn, I mean, that's the whole paradigm of the Warren Court, Matt v. Ohio, all of that. So, it keeps us honest.
So, Mark, does this sarcasm detector work?
Are you testing him now?
You obviously don't think so, right?
It's sarcasm. Probably pretty good.
No, well, I mean, the gentleman in the audience raised the phrase sarcasm detector, but one of the great things that's happening in computing now is, in terms of these content analytics, is we're expanding our ability to do things that only humans used to be able to do. So you can now, you can sort of funnel up underlying sentiment from large volumes of text. You can begin to generate the ability to figure out when something is a pun or a joke, just as Watson did when it played Jeopardy, because a lot of the Jeopardy clues are actually puns or kind of misleading or anagrams, So those kinds of abilities are becoming deliverable through technology now. I'm not saying we have a perfect sarcasm detector, I wish I did, but it would be helpful in many contexts.
And with that, we are out of time. Thank you very much.